This episode follows the final cliff dive of Ben Carter, whose chest-mounted camera continued recording briefly after he vanished beneath the surface. Rescue teams recovered footage showing the moments before impact, along with disturbing audio from the scene. The investigation would reveal how a miscalculation at this notorious California cliff turned a routine dive into tragedy. Ben Carter stood at the edge of Devil's Drop, 85 feet above the Pacific Ocean, with the confidence of someone who had conquered fear through preparation. At 28, he was a professional cliff diver who had spent 8 years building a reputation for technical precision and fearless execution. His specialty was high-altitude dives from challenging locations, the kind that separated professionals from weekend thrill seekers. Ben's journey into extreme diving had begun during college, when a spring break trip to Acapulco introduced him to the legendary La Quebrada cliff divers. Watching those professionals execute perfect dives from impossible heights had ignited something in him that traditional sports never could. He spent the following summer learning proper technique at a diving facility in San Diego, working with former Olympic coaches who taught him the fundamentals of body control and spatial awareness. Over the years, Ben had methodically conquered increasingly challenging locations across the western United States. His personal portfolio included successful jumps from the sea cliffs of Big Sur, the granite formations of Lake Tahoe, and the volcanic ledges of the Oregon coast. Each location had taught him something new about reading conditions, calculating trajectories, and managing the psychological pressure. This wasn't Ben's first encounter with Devil's Drop. He had visited this notorious Northern California cliff 3 times over the past month, each trip dedicated to understanding every variable that could affect his dive. He carried a laser rangefinder to measure distances from the edge. He studied tide charts from previous months, looking for patterns. He interviewed other divers who had jumped successfully, asking detailed questions about launch angles and water depth at various tide levels. Ben's preparation routine was exhaustive by design. He photographed the cliff from multiple angles, documenting the rock formations and measuring distances to potential hazards. He studied weather patterns for the region, looking for seasonal trends that might affect wind conditions or tidal behavior. He even researched the geological composition of the cliff face. Ben had already visualized this dive sequence dozens of times during mental rehearsals. He studied videos of other successful jumps, frame by frame, analyzing body position and trajectory. Everything pointed toward this being achievable if conditions aligned properly. Another challenging dive to add to his growing portfolio of conquered locations. The cliff formation descended vertically to meet the water below, where submerged rock shelves extended outward from the base, invisible from above. The area experienced tidal cycles that could exceed 6 feet, making water depth highly sensitive to timing. Local divers knew the location well, and they knew its history. Devil's Drop had earned its name honestly over decades of local lore. 2 injuries had been recorded in 2015, both involving jumpers who struck submerged rocks. Both required helicopter evacuation. Warning messages were spray-painted on nearby boulders by locals who had witnessed accidents over the years. The messages had faded, but remained visible to anyone who looked closely. The rock formation itself was a product of millions of years of coastal erosion, creating a nearly perfect vertical drop that attracted thrill seekers from across the country. The cliff face showed distinct geological layers, with harder granite sections creating the stable platform at the top, while softer sedimentary layers below had been carved away by centuries of wave action. It was a place where the ocean met stone with brutal indifference. The rock formation attracted thrill seekers despite its reputation, despite the warnings, despite the documented history of close calls and injuries. But Ben's confidence came from preparation, not recklessness. He had done his homework. His plan was to document the dive using multiple cameras for training analysis and potential sponsorship materials. A chest-mounted camera would capture the first-person perspective, while a second device operated from the cliff top would record the full descent. The footage would demonstrate his technical skills to potential sponsors in the extreme sports industry. Ben had built his career on calculated risks. Each successful dive added credibility to his professional reputation. Devil's Drop represented another step forward, a challenging location that would showcase his abilities and expand his portfolio of conquered sites. What Ben couldn't see from his extensive preparation was an atmospheric deception that had been building for days. An offshore high-pressure system had been lingering over the region for 48 hours. The system was subtle enough that it hadn't made local weather reports, but it was quietly suppressing local sea level, reducing actual water depth compared to tide chart predictions. This meteorological phenomenon, known as inverse barometric effect, occurs when sustained high pressure literally pushes down on the ocean's surface. For every millibar of pressure above normal, sea level drops approximately 1 centimeter. The high-pressure system affecting the coast that day was registering 15 millibars above average, translating to a sea level depression of nearly 6 inches. This delay, combined with local swell patterns and barometric pressure effects, placed the water level 1 to 2 feet lower than predicted. At most diving locations, this difference would be negligible. At Devil's Drop, it was enough to erase an already razor-thin safety margin. Anton Riggs, Ben's longtime friend who had agreed to handle camera work, had spent weeks researching Devil's Drop online. He found forum posts describing the jump as having zero margin for error. One post in particular described it as extremely dangerous, even when completed successfully. The poster had written that everything needed to be perfect: the tide, the wind, the angle. And even then, the rocks were closer than expected. Anton had discovered additional concerning information during his research. A marine biology study from 2018 had documented the exact underwater topography around Devil's Drop using sonar mapping. The study revealed that the submerged rock shelf extended much further from the cliff base than most divers realized. Anton had expressed concerns about the location multiple times. He had read about the 2 previous injuries at the site, both involving miscalculated jumps and submerged rocks. That morning, during the drive up the coast, Anton had suggested checking tide conditions again and waiting another hour to be safe. Ben had dismissed this suggestion with the confidence of someone who had done extensive homework. Della Lane, Ben's girlfriend of 14 months, had opposed the Devil's Drop dive from the moment Ben first mentioned it 3 weeks earlier. As an emergency room nurse, she had treated cliff diving injuries and understood the potential consequences. She had seen broken bones, ruptured organs, and spinal cord injuries that left young, healthy people paralyzed. Della's opposition wasn't based on general anxiety about Ben's hobby. She had attended many of his previous jumps and understood the calculated nature of his approach. But Devil's Drop was different. She had researched the location independently and found the injury reports that concerned her. The night before, she had told Ben plainly that she would not attend to watch the dive. It wasn't an ultimatum, just a boundary she needed to set for herself. That morning, Ben had sent her a text saying the conditions looked perfect, and this dive would be an important addition to his portfolio. She hadn't responded. Simon Troy, who had jumped Devil's Drop 4 times between 2014 and 2016, drove up on impulse when he saw Ben's social media post about heading to the cliffs. Simon's confidence came from experience, but experience in slightly different conditions. His previous jumps had all occurred during peak summer high tides in late August. July conditions brought more tidal variability than he had fully considered. Simon's successful jumps had all taken place during optimal conditions: spring tides that brought maximum water depth, calm weather with minimal wind, and perfect visibility. He had never attempted the jump during the more variable conditions that characterized other times of year. When the 3 men arrived at Devil's Drop in the early afternoon, Anton noticed something concerning. The kelp beds were visible much closer to shore than Simon had described from his previous jumps. The dark brown strands swayed in the current, marking the boundary between deeper water and shallower areas near the rocks. This suggested the water level might be significantly lower than expected. The kelp beds were a subtle but important indicator. Experienced divers use them to gauge water depth and tide conditions. Their position relative to the shore could reveal whether the tide was running higher or lower than predicted. In this case, they were telling a story that contradicted the official tide charts. The kelp forest in this area was particularly dense due to the nutrient-rich upwelling that occurred along this section of coast. During high tide conditions, the kelp canopy would be completely submerged, invisible from the surface. The fact that individual fronds were clearly visible suggested that water levels were significantly lower than predicted. Anton mentioned this observation to Ben. Ben acknowledged the concern but seemed confident in proceeding. He had committed to making the jump, and most other conditions appeared favorable. The wind was steady, visibility was excellent, and he had successfully completed jumps from similar heights before. Ben positioned himself several feet back from the edge and marked his starting point with a small pile of rocks. He went through his pre-jump routine, stretching his shoulders and taking deep breaths to center himself. He had developed this routine over years of extreme sports, a way of preparing mentally for irreversible commitments. The routine was important to Ben. It helped him focus and eliminate distractions. He would visualize the jump sequence multiple times, checking his mental checklist of variables. Wind direction, water conditions, launch angle, body position. Each element needed to align for a successful jump. Ben's pre-jump ritual had evolved over years of competition in professional diving. He would begin by checking his equipment one final time, ensuring the chest camera was secure, adjusting the harness for optimal positioning, and verifying that nothing would shift during the fall. Then came the physical preparation. Specific stretches designed to optimize his body position during the dive. The mental component was equally important. Ben would close his eyes and run through the entire sequence in his mind, from the first running step to the moment of water entry. He visualized potential complications and his responses to them. This mental rehearsal had become second nature. Anton activated the chest camera and gave a thumbs-up signal. Simon was positioned on the beach below with his phone recording. The wind remained steady at 12 miles per hour. The sun's reflection off the water's surface created a mirror effect that made judging depth difficult from above. The afternoon light was creating challenging visual conditions. The sun's angle produced a glare on the water surface that obscured the underwater features that Ben needed to see for final trajectory adjustments. This glare effect was something he had anticipated and planned for, but it still added uncertainty. Ben took one final look at his intended landing zone, visualizing the trajectory he had rehearsed dozens of times over the past few weeks. 4 steps: plant, launch, extend, and enter. The sequence was simple in theory, but required precise execution in practice. The margin for error at Devil's Drop was minimal. A few degrees difference in launch angle, a slight miscalculation in timing, or unexpected wind conditions could alter the trajectory enough to create problems. Ben understood this intellectually, but confidence built from years of successful jumps made the risks feel manageable. Ben's calculation was based on achieving a launch velocity that would carry him approximately 15 feet from the cliff base before water entry. This distance would clear the known underwater obstacles while maintaining a trajectory steep enough for a clean entry. The afternoon temperature had reached the mid-70s. Wind came from the northwest at 12 miles per hour. Visibility was clear across the Pacific. The surface showed occasional whitecaps and kelp beds closer to shore. Everything appeared ready. Ben had already committed. The cameras were rolling. Simon was in position below. Anton was ready at the cliff top. The mental preparation was complete. The physical preparation was complete. The only thing left was execution. Then he began his approach. 4 running steps to build momentum, each stride calculated to reach optimal speed. Ben's right foot planted near the cliff edge as his left leg drove upward, converting horizontal motion into the launch. He cleared the edge and entered free fall. Ben's approach had been textbook perfect. His acceleration was smooth and controlled, building to exactly the velocity he had calculated during his preparation. The plant step occurred precisely where he had marked it, and his launch angle matched what he had visualized during his mental rehearsals. Ben's body extended into the dive position he had practiced, Arms tight against his sides, toes pointed downward, he dropped through 85 feet of open air above the Pacific. The northwest wind contributed a slight lateral drift, compounding an already narrow margin for error. The wind effect was subtle but significant. At this height, even small deviations combined with wind could shift the landing point by a couple of critical feet. Ben made minor adjustments to his body position during the fall, trying to compensate for the drift. During the fall, Ben adjusted his body position slightly, reacting to a trajectory that no longer matched his planned line. The visual references he had memorized during his preparation weren't aligning as expected. The kelp beds appeared closer than they should have been, and the angle of approach to the water seemed steeper than his calculations had predicted. Anton's camera captured the descent from above. Simon watched from the beach below, his phone recording the fall. For the first 2 seconds, everything appeared to be proceeding normally. Ben's form looked good and the trajectory seemed clean. Then, Simon's expression changed abruptly. He registered something wrong in the angle, something in the way Ben's body was tracking through the air. The path was taking him closer to the submerged rocks than it should have. The trajectory was slightly off, not by much, but enough to matter at this location. Simon had seen this exact scenario before, though not at Devil's Drop. He had witnessed other jumpers make similar miscalculations at different locations. The angle looked wrong from his perspective on the beach. Ben was tracking too close to the cliff base, not clearing the submerged obstacles with an adequate margin. From Simon's vantage point on the beach, he could see the underwater rock formations through the clear water. The submerged shelf was clearly visible, extending further from the cliff base than Ben's trajectory would clear. Simon opened his mouth and shouted, but his warning was completely swallowed by the sound of waves crashing against the cliff base. The distance was too great, the ambient noise too loud. His voice could not carry far enough to reach Ben during the critical seconds of the fall. Ben struck something beneath the surface. There was no clean entry into deep water. Instead, a dull, unnatural sound carried upward, subtly but unmistakably different from the sharp splash of a clean water entry. It was the wrong kind of sound, the kind that indicated impact with something solid rather than water. The impact occurred approximately 13 feet from the cliff base, just beneath the surface where the submerged rock shelf extended outward. The collision happened at high speed after a fall of more than 80 feet. The sound was unmistakable to anyone who had heard similar impacts before. The physics of the impact were devastating. Ben's body, traveling at approximately 50 miles per hour after the 85-foot fall, struck the granite shelf with tremendous force. The underwater collision occurred at a depth of roughly 4 feet, where the rock formation created an invisible barrier. The splash that followed looked different too. The water where Ben had entered began showing darker streaks spreading outward from the point of impact. Simon stood frozen for a fraction of a second, processing what he had witnessed. Then his body reacted instinctively. He dropped his phone onto the sand and ran toward the water. Anton, still positioned at the top of the cliff, could not see the details of what had happened beneath the surface. He had watched Ben launch cleanly, seen the descent, and witnessed the entry. But Ben had not surfaced. 5 seconds passed, then 10, then 15. The absence of Ben's head breaking the surface was the first clear indication that something had gone wrong. In a successful cliff dive, the jumper would surface within seconds, often with arms raised in triumph. The continued absence of any movement in the water was alarming. Simon entered the water and swam hard toward the area where Ben had gone under. He covered the distance in less than 30 seconds, his breathing labored by the time he reached the location. Simon dove beneath the surface, forcing his eyes open despite the salt sting. The water was clouding rapidly from a combination of blood, aerated seawater, and disturbed sediment near the rock shelf. Dark material was spreading through the water column, reducing clarity even further. Simon swept his arms in wide, searching arcs until his hand made contact with something. He grabbed hold and pulled. Ben's body came toward him, completely limp and unresisting. Simon managed to get his arms under Ben's shoulders and kicked hard toward the surface. When he broke through, gasping for air, He immediately began struggling to keep Ben's face above the waterline while swimming backward toward shore. Ben's body felt wrong in Simon's grip. There was no muscle tension, no natural buoyancy, no assistance with staying afloat. The natural tension that should exist in a living body was completely absent. Blood was clearly visible now, streaming from Ben's head and mixing with the seawater. Ben's eyes were open, his gaze unfocused, with little visible response to the bright sunlight. There was no coughing or purposeful movement, only shallow, irregular breaths that quickly faded. Ben remained absolutely still as Simon fought against the current to reach the rocky beach. The lack of any response was more alarming than any injury Simon could see. Simon's feet finally found the bottom, and he dragged Ben's body up onto the rocks. He positioned Ben flat on his back on the most level section of beach he could find. Ben's head lolled to one side, and blood immediately began pooling beneath it, spreading across the dark rocks. Simon's hands were shaking as he tilted Ben's head back and checked for any sign of breathing. He could detect nothing. He placed 2 fingers against Ben's neck, searching for a pulse at the carotid artery. If there was one, it was weak and difficult to detect. Simon quickly positioned his hands on Ben's chest and began compressions, trying to recall the proper rhythm from a CPR class he had taken years earlier. With several compressions, pink-tinged fluid and air bubbled from Ben's nose and mouth, indicating severe internal injury. Ben's chest did not respond normally beneath Simon's hands, the resistance uneven and wrong in a way that immediately suggested catastrophic injury. Anton was already descending the cliff trail as fast as he could manage. When he finally reached the beach, breathing hard and stumbling across the uneven rocks, he found Simon still performing chest compressions. Ben lay motionless beneath him, and there was an alarming amount of blood visible on the surrounding rocks. Anton dropped to his knees beside them and pulled out his phone with trembling hands. He dialed emergency services and explained the situation as clearly as possible. Cliff diving accident, severe trauma, no breathing detected, no pulse found. The dispatcher confirmed that an ambulance was being dispatched, but explained that the estimated arrival time was 18 to 22 minutes just to reach the parking area at the top of the cliff. From there, paramedics would still need to hike down the trail carrying their equipment. They alternated compressions when their arms became too tired to continue effectively. Ben's skin color was changing progressively from its normal tone to pale, then gray, then developing a bluish tint around the lips and fingernails. His eyes remained open throughout, staring upward without focus or response. No matter how many times they checked, Ben's pulse remained faint and inconsistent. When they placed their ears against Ben's chest, breathing was shallow and sporadic, difficult to distinguish over the surf. There was no response to any of their resuscitation efforts, no sign that the compressions were having any effect. First responders finally arrived at the trailhead parking area, 22 minutes after Anton's emergency call. The descent took them an additional 8 minutes, moving as quickly as possible while carrying medical gear and a rescue basket for patient transport. When they finally reached the beach level, they found Anton and Simon sitting several feet away from Ben's body. Both men were covered in blood and seawater, and both had fallen silent. The lead paramedic moved immediately to Ben's side and began a systematic assessment. He checked for a pulse at the carotid artery using proper technique. He examined pupil response using a small flashlight. He placed his stethoscope against Ben's chest and listened carefully for any heart sounds or breathing. The paramedic worked methodically for several minutes, checking everything that protocol required. He looked for any signs of life, any indication that resuscitation efforts might be successful. Then he sat back and looked at his colleagues. There was nothing left to attempt. The injuries were beyond what any intervention could address. Too much time had passed. The trauma was too severe. Ben Carter was confirmed deceased at the scene. The official cause of death was blunt force trauma sustained during impact with submerged rocks. A post-incident review found no evidence of equipment malfunction or external interference. The chest-mounted camera recovered from Ben's body contained footage of the final moments before impact. The investigation concluded that atmospheric conditions had reduced water depth below predicted levels, eliminating the safety margin that Ben's calculations had depended upon. Thanks for watching. Want to see more? Click on your screen now.